Yep. Did you hear that?
I did too. I was watching. I was logged in.
I told several people, make sure you tell them that. So.
Good evening. It is so good to be back with you today. And is that sounding loud enough or too loud? Is it echoing or?
Thumbs up.
Sounds all right? All right. Sometimes it can be me. Sometimes it can be Wendy's fault. Sometimes it's Wendy's fault. What can I say? So.
And a good associate pastor recognizes that. So.
For all of you who are worshiping with it, or not worshiping, but studying with us today online, we're thrilled to have you being a part of the evening as we come together to study and to learn. So glad all of you could be here together as well tonight. And why don't we bow for a word of prayer? Oh God, we thank you for this evening, a time when we can come as a family of faith to study your word, to see how you moved in history, and to see how you continue to move in our history now. Fill us with your Holy Spirit that we might be open to the new truths that you have for us, to the leading that you have for us in our lives. Oh God, help us to know how as we study your word and as we follow you, we can be the people who are open to go out and be kind. Amen. You may remember, I believe I have this straight, that it was 15 years ago today that we had the plane crash for OSU, in which we lost 10 people, and what a tragic time that was, and what an important time to remember as we go back and think about how love was shared and lost, and yet also God brings healing in our time. Tomorrow is the 30th anniversary of the Challenger, and that's hard to believe. That was 30 years ago. That's one of those kind of things that you usually remember exactly where you were when you hear some of those tragic news. And I can do that when I go back and I'm looking around to see how many can remember where they were when Kennedy was shot. Most of you here, not all of you.
I can't remember.
Wendy can't. So that's right. So what a time that really was. And again, it's one of those issues of life that helps to recenter you as you see again the fragility of life, the realities of life, and how it is that God calls us to continue to heal and to be people of hope. And so I think it is important that we take time to remember.
My grandparents we came from Ohio, and my family moved to Oklahoma, but my grandparents were in Ohio, but they were snowbirds, and they would go to Florida, and they had a place just outside Orlando, and so they were at the Kennedy Space Center for the Challenger, and so it really shook them to the very core, and I know it just was a very devastating thing for them to see, and yet they felt they carried that, and they really wanted to remember them always, and so it was a very tender time.
It's why we come together tonight, though, to study God's Word and to be able to go back and to remember the history and to see how God moved in history and how God is still moving in our history today. And we have the wonderful stories all about the many things that happened at Jericho.
Very excited. We have 3 different places that we're going to talk about tonight: Jericho, Mount Carmel, and Megiddo. And there's a commonality between all of these as places of conflict. And so I want to start off just with an intro story before we get to Jericho. Moses had been taken up to the top of Mount Nebo and been told by God, look out upon all this land, look out at the promised land. And he was told, this is the land that your people will inhabit, but you're not going to be able to make that trip. And so Moses was on this side of the Jordan River, and this is a picture taken from the top of Mount Nebo. And the different areas that you can see, it shows right here, straight across you can see Jericho and Jerusalem just a little bit off to the left, and Bethlehem. On a very clear day, you can actually see as far as the Mediterranean when it's not hazy. But remember, this is not a very big country, so that's part of that. But that's the entry, the first glimpse that we start to see of Jericho is Moses, the patriarch of the Hebrew people, is not going to get to go in. He can see it. He could see the vision for the future of the Hebrew people, but he's held back.
I'll never forget as I learned that story, and I still believe this now after I've been a pastor for 42 years. When I get to heaven, I'm going to ask God about that one. That really seemed really unfair. This guy worked so hard, put up with the Hebrew people and all that they had to go through, and he gets this close and doesn't get to go in. I know it all worked out just fine, but I'm still going to ask that question. Why did that happen like that? What happened was he gets turned over to Joshua. Joshua, you remember, is a leader, not quite as young anymore. Joshua was, when they got ready to go into the promised land 40 years before, it turned out that you had Moses who sent in 12 spies to go check out the land. 2 of the spies were going to wind up being Joshua and Caleb. So Joshua went to go spy out the land with Caleb and 10 others, and they brought the message back to Moses and said, "It is a land flowing with milk and honey. It is great. We're going to love living there." And then the other 10 said, "Except for the fact that there are people there who look like giants, and we are but grasshoppers in their sight." And so with this kind of statement, in the end, the people all cry out, "Let's go back to Egypt." They decided not to go into the promised land, and so they wound up wandering in the wilderness for about another 38 years. Not a good time. So now after wandering in the wilderness for all that time, now they get ready to try to come in again at a different place. Brent, would you mind catching the one door back there for us? They decide that they're going to have to try to come in through a different way after this many years. And now Moses dies, and it's Joshua who now is going to be in charge. One of the spies who went to check out the promised land.
Joshua didn't get to go into the promised land when he was ready, and he was faithful, and yet he and Caleb had to wait for basically 40 years. Even though they were the faithful ones who brought back a favorable report, they still were held back with the others.
Sometimes we want God to answer our prayers and things to work out quickly. They don't always work out quickly, but they were faithful. And so now it's Joshua's turn, and what he does is he sends out spies. Does anybody remember how many spies he sends out? 2. Moses sent out 12. 10 brought back a bad report. 2 brought back a good report. Joshua sends out 2 spies. I think he's hoping for a little bit better luck this time. And so he sends out 2 spies, and they go to Jericho. They're trying to check out the land, and they come to this fortified city. Now, Jericho is fascinating in that we believe Jericho is one of the oldest inhabited cities continuously on earth. Some say it is the oldest continuously inhabited city on earth. We definitely know it's one of the oldest. I mean, going back to more than 9,000 BCE, I mean, that's incredible. So people had been living there over and over and over again. We're going to kind of look at some of that sort of stuff tonight, the archaeology that goes on there. But people had lived there for a long, long time. Now the Canaanites had settled into Jericho. They had walls, and it was a strong place. Just as a parenthesis on that, you really have kind of the people of culture, or they've settled down, they're living in a specific place, and you have the hordes, the masses of the people of Israel who've been wandering around in the desert.
Uncultured, kind of, you know, all those different kind of movies of country bumpkin going to the big city, the Big Apple, and that's what this is like. They don't have the technology. They don't have the civilization.
People of Canaan, they've been settled there now for a while. So they're in the city. So we have 2 spies who are going to go check this out. Again, sometimes I think we get this idea that the land of Canaan was completely empty when the people of Israel came. No, you had a lot of people living there. And so the people of Israel have to find their way into this land, this promised land. that would have been promised back to Abraham to come into Canaan. So they're going to come, first of all, to the city of Jericho, and the two spies go into the city, and even though it's now this city, a large place of people, people notice strangers. And so the two strangers immediately go to Rahab's, who is a prostitute who's living in the wall. It wasn't as unusual to see two strangers going to visit the prostitute. It didn't attract as much attention. They go to Rahab, and they begin to ask, as Rahab says, "Oh my goodness, we've heard all about you. We've heard about how your God parted the Red Sea. We've heard about how strong you are, that your God is the one true God." All these things that just really take back these two spies, and she tells them anything they want to know about the city and about the land, and they're very grateful for that. And in the end, she says, "Look, I'm asking one thing out of you. Don't kill me. Don't kill my family." She asks that you save my mother and father, my brothers and sisters, and all of their families. It's really fascinating. Rahab is the one who starts asking for all these people's safety and well-being. Not just mine, but my mom and my dad, my brothers and my sisters, all their families. And so the spies finally say, "Okay, you've been good to us." I like it. If you go back and read it, it says, "You have been kind to us, we will be kind to you."
By information. She gave them information.
Yeah, that's right.
And,
it was
and
information.
Safety. And
so,
safety.
"You've been kind to us, we will be kind to you." And I couldn't help but think when I read this about the Kindness Project. Here we are about this issue of what does it mean to be kind. So they got their information. She tells them here's what I'll tell them. They came looking for them. The people of the city came looking for the men, and she said, "They've been here, but they're out of here. They're gone." And she was hiding them on the roof. She sent them away to say, "I bet if you chase them, you'll catch them." And they began chasing all the way to the Jordan River, but no one was going to be there. They were on the roof. They waited until nighttime, and when it was nighttime, since she lives in the city wall, then she lets them down by a rope outside the city wall so they can escape for 2 days into the woods to wait until the other people come back, and then they can make it safely back to Joshua. They say, when the attack happens, you stay inside. If you go out on the street, we are not going to be responsible for what happens. You stay inside and hang a scarlet cord that they gave her in the window. And that'll be a sign we don't hurt anyone here. And so it was Joshua ultimately bring back the troops. And the troops come, and you certainly know the story of how they come back and they get the army and they march around. They have people out in the lead, and they got the Ark of God, Ark of the Covenant, and they're bringing that, and they got people blowing a horn the whole time they march around, and they march around once, and then they go take a break for the rest of the day. Second day, they march all the way around, they're blowing their horns, carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and they take a break. They do this for 6 days. Can't say a word when you're out there marching. And finally, on the 7th day, Joshua says, "Just hang with me now. Nobody say a word." They get out there and they march once, and twice. They do 7 times. At this point, the people of Jericho, I'm sure, were thinking, the plot is to drive us crazy with those horns. How much noise can be going on out here as they're blowing these horns on and on and on. And at the end of the 7th time, then he says, "Shout." And they all shout. And it says the walls fell down. And the people of Israel come marching in, and they kill every man, woman, and child, and oxen, and sheep, except in this one place where there's a scarlet cord, and they bring out Rahab and all of her families. This becomes the first place where the people of Israel now gain a foothold and begin to enter in back from the promised land, since they left back in the time of Jacob.
Here's a scripture that Bob had just recounted, and where she had talked to the king of Jericho, and she talked about giving them excuse, and she hid the men on top of the roof. And here's kind of artwork depicting that scene where they're up on the roof, and there's also included the scarlet cord out of her window to show you that. What's interesting is this is her testimony. And she says, we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites. And when we heard it, our hearts melted. What's fascinating to us, we were talking about this, is here's Rahab in the city of Jericho, and she and all the people of Jericho have heard the story of the God of the Israelites. The Israelites who had been wandering out in the desert, the wilderness, for basically 40 years, they had heard the story. They had heard the message. We have gotten close to 500 different requests outside of our church family from people who watch our television program and our online worship broadcasts, people wanting to be a part of the Kindness Project. And over in the comments section, people were writing, I watch your show every single week before I had to go to my church. Or I am not able to get out and I watch it every single week. And so over and over, we were getting this message that people were saying, I hear your message. Every single week, I'm connected to your message. And so something like this today really resounds very deeply with us, that we might not know all the people in the world who hear our message. And so we need to make sure that we're broadcasting the message through our lives and through our ministries as a whole that tells the story that we want told. Here's the little cartoon. It says, the 2 spies escaped Jericho with the help of Rahab the prostitute. Being saved by a prostitute was not an easy story to share with their wives. So, I thought that was... When we come to the aftermath, the young men who had done the spying, the young men went in and brought out Rahab and her father and mother, her brothers and sisters, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. And then they burned the whole city and everything in it, but they took the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her because she hid the men Joshua had sent in to spies to Jericho, and she lives among the Israelites to this day. Now you jump forward to the Gospel of Matthew, and we talked a little bit about this, how each gospel begins a little bit differently. Matthew begins with telling us the genealogy of Christ. And remember that Matthew is speaking to a Jewish audience, Jewish believers, and he's telling them how Jesus Christ is connected to King David and Abraham. But part of the genealogy says this: Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab; Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth; Obed, the father of Jesse; Jesse, the father of King David; David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. Now here he's just getting it out there. He's telling these people, faithful Jewish believers, okay, the lineage of the Messiah has a prostitute, a foreigner, and an adulteress. And he's saying this, I think, to really tell us God is about bringing people into the family of God, about reconnecting people in their relationship with God. And this is the message that we are to broadcast. This is the message we're to share with the world, that God cares for all people. I do think it's interesting that only Rahab and Ruth are named in this passage, but here you have 3 women in rapid succession named in the lineage of Christ.
Because when you look at the lineage, if you go back and read, it's all men being listed, except these women. It's always men's name who are being listed, the father of, the father of, the father. And then they throw these in. And so when that happens, I mean, you have to have your ears pick up to know Matthew is trying to very much to make a conscious point here. This isn't just kind of happening. This is the message to a group of people who struggle with this issue of, what does it mean for us to be pure? What does it mean for us to be holy and righteous? Because we are supposed to try to be holy and righteous, the very best we can be, but never self-righteous, Never that point of being so holy we want to condemn everybody else, because the gospel of Christ is to be saying, we're welcoming all people in. And so for Matthew, there was to be writing to the Jewish people and to include this as the lineage was a very significant statement that was being made to the people about the gift of God's grace.
Now, and for people who are Jewish, your Jewish identity, your Jewishness didn't come by your father. It came by your mother. So if you were born to a Jewish mother, you're Jewish. If your father wasn't and your mother was not Jewish, then you have to come into the Jewish faith. But if your mom's Jewish, you became Jewish. And so for him to outline this paternal lineage, and then the three women, and remember, the women are the ones who make you Jewish. The three women he identifies are these three women. So it becomes even more fascinating to say the Jewish women, or the way that this passes down, also includes these as part of your Jewish identity. So it's an incredible statement here.
When you go back and look at the story, that we're going to look at some more of what happens in Jericho besides this part of it, but this part is so significant because it's the people of Israel moving into the promised land. And as they're going to move into the promised land, there's all kinds of archaeologists who wanted to go back and look at this issue of the walls crumbling around around Jericho. And there were some original archaeologists who were going, there's evidence that the walls came down, and this must have been exactly the time of Joshua. And then there's others go, no, those were 1400 and 1500 BC when those walls came down. Maybe it's a different time. You're going to hear all kinds, and other people that start talking about, well, there must have been an earthquake that caused this. Have fun reading all this stuff, but don't get lost in the historicity of, did it really happen exactly at this time? Or the science, was there an earthquake that would have made this happen?
Where the ground was loose, and so because they were walking around, you can really, it's fun to kind of think of that, but you can get lost in it.
What I think when the writer of this story was sharing with Israel was trying to say, it's not just a message of what happened in the past, it's supposed to be a message of what's still happening to the people that day. And that's what I would want us to hear. We're trying to look at Jericho and the battles and what went on, not just to say what happened in Jericho, but what is that message for us today? Because I believe what the writer is trying to say is, if you are faithful to following God, then you're going to confront incredible obstacles. You have the people who are like the barbarians to the Romans. The Romans are cultured, strong, weapons, and you got the masses. Well, you got the masses, the people of Israel. And they're coming against the settled-in Canaanites in fortified cities. That's why the original recount was, they are like giants and we are like grasshoppers to them. But the point is, be faithful. Trust God to confront even your giants, even those huge obstacles. And if you are willing to trust God as we go confront these things, then God will lead you into the promised land. That is, God will lead you into life. Not always the way you expect it and see it, but the promise that it's going to be life and it will be good. I think there's the specific message of what this is about. We tried, you were not faithful, we wandered in the wilderness. Because we are faithful, we're going to move in and confront our giants and fortresses, and we're going to find a promised land. That's why the story was being retold.
Yeah, the scripture talking about them marching around the city, and so here's some artwork depicting that, and you can see in the background the walls are starting to crumble. One of the interesting things that happens is after Jericho is destroyed, Joshua issues a curse upon the city and says that at the cost of the firstborn shall anyone lay its foundation, and the cost of his youngest son shall he set up its gates. And the thought is that if you're losing your firstborn and your youngest, basically the curse is you're going to lose everything in between. You will lose your family if you restore Jericho. Under King Ahab, you'll see in 1 Kings, Ahab sent a man by the name of Hillel of Bethel. He rebuilt Jericho, and he laid its foundations at the cost of his firstborn and set up his gates at the cost of his youngest son, according to the word of the Lord, which was spoken by Joshua. And so this city was supposed to lay demolished as kind of another statement of this is what God has opened up and created a pathway and not a city on its own defenses. One of the stories I love about the Jericho event is that, okay, you have God telling Joshua to go out and conquer Jericho. And so it seems pretty much that God is on the side of Joshua, and Jericho is going to be demolished. You would tend to think that if Joshua is told to go demolish Jericho, God is on the side of Joshua. But before this battle, he encounters an angel of the Lord. And so Joshua is wondering, here's this guy and looking like a soldier himself. And he says, okay, whose side are you on, mine or Jericho's? And the angel says, neither. I'm on the side of the Lord. And I think that's one of the messages here. I mean, I almost hear the angel kind of bewildered. Why would you think I was on, one side or another? God is for all people. And though it may appear that there's one side or another, there's only one side that we can be on as people. And we're going to talk about this later. How can we serve two masters? You can only be on one side, and that's the side of the Lord. We come to the New Testament stories that involve Jericho, and one of those begins with Jesus being taken out into the wilderness to the Mount of Temptation, and there he is tempted by the devil. And in the area of Jericho, this is kind of the landscape. Remember when we talk about the wilderness, I tend to think of jungle, but it's desert. It's rocky desert. And there are a couple different monasteries that are set up. This is the area of Jericho, okay? And so this is a monastery set up on the cliffside to commemorate the Mount of Temptation, this area. But what's important as we talk about the next story is that look at this area and look how desolate it is. If you're traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, which Jesus would do, Jesus would preach and have ministry there in Jericho. He healed a blind man. But can you imagine how easy it would be for robbers to attack you if you're in this area?
It's kind of fun when you stop and look at it. I mean, here you got Jericho destroyed. You're coming in, and now go look back at all the other things that'll happen. Jesus is led into the wilderness, right there by Jericho, for 40 days and 40 nights to be tempted. And so we have this mountain of temptation, and you do have a monastery there. And of course, we're getting ready to go into Lent. It's not very long. We're going to be having Ash Wednesday. This year, really early. Easter falls on the last Sunday in March. It's the earliest that Easter can come. So, before that, there's always 40 days, not including Sundays.
Because Sundays are always a day of celebration of Easter.
And so every Sunday is a Easter day. It's a day of joy. And the 40 days of temptation, of wrestling in the wilderness, we're not supposed to be a time of joy, but what is life? And I'm facing the challenges of life. And so the idea of the 40 days of Lent come from this story about Jesus being tempted in the wilderness by the devil here at Jericho. So the foundation for our following of Lent goes back to this kind of thing. So there is a wonderful thing. If you go to Jericho, there's a nice cable car. You do not have to. It's a long ride. It's a tough walk. Or it's 5 minutes by cable car. We can get you up there and you can go look at it. And so,
one or the other.
If you've never been to Israel, and I hope everybody has a chance to do that sometime in your lifetime, it wound up being one of those kind of things I looked back and thought, why in the world didn't I do that sooner in my life? Because as when he said, so things are so much different from what you have in your mind. When you said the wilderness, I'm looking at big trees, dense. No, wilderness means there's no water, there's rock. That's all that there is.
When we come to talk about the Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leads me into green pastures and beside the still waters. This is the kind of area where that psalm was written. I had always thought, I don't know why, but you know the movie The Quiet Man with John Wayne? I love that movie. And I don't know why, I always thought that's where the psalm, it's that lush, deep grass where sheep don't really have to turn around. They're just stuck and you can barely see them because the grass is so thick and deep green. And no, you need a shepherd in places like this because can you find the grass? That's what going to Israel, it starts to, oh my gosh, I get a whole different meaning now. I need a place, if I'm out in this kind of area, boy, I need a shepherd to guide me to, here's a couple little sprigs of grass or here's some. You need a shepherd to guide you. And instead of almost an American way of thinking of abundance and we don't have need of anything because it's all surrounding us, no, there's a deep sense of we are totally relying on the shepherd, on God. And so it really changes your image.
Well, when you look at Jericho, you remember Jerusalem set up on a hill. Jericho is now going to be down. And so you're going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. When the Bible tells you we went down somewhere, they mean physically we went down. It's not like if I say, yeah, I'm going down to Texas, I'm driving somewhere.
Going south.
I'm going south, That's not what it meant. That's all about they're going down. So you go down, and so they're wandering on this road. And of course, I think one of the two most important stories that Jesus tells us takes place between Jerusalem and Jericho. For we have a Jew who went down the road and he was jumped by robbers, and there he was beaten and left for dead. When you look at that kind of terrain, you can see it's a great place for robbers to hang out. And so beaten and left for dead, and then along comes a priest and sees him, passes by on the other side of the road. Along comes a Levite.
Oh, think about for a second, if you or somebody else in this area and you see somebody who's been beaten up, aren't you going to wonder, if I stop, maybe they're going to come back? If I stop and get beaten up, who's going to help me? You could almost see kind of the thinking. We really lash out after the priests, but you can almost see why they would be scared in this kind of area. Who's going to help me? Or I don't know what all happened.
So they pass by until along comes a Samaritan who doesn't get along with Jews. Jews don't get along with Samaritans. And the Samaritan will stop and help the Jew. And Jesus says, this is what it means to be a good neighbor. It's the story of what it means to be kind. To be able to see the need and not be afraid to help, to choose to be kind. And so the story is really happening right here at Jericho that we're going to be reading about now in the New Testament.
Real quickly, just some of the modern day archaeology of the site now. There's probably as many archaeological digs at Jericho as in Jerusalem. It's an incredible area just because it's been conquered so many times. One of the fascinating things that happened, a very famous archaeologist, Kathleen Kenyon, she was a British archaeologist. Her father was a very famous biblical scholar. She went to Jericho and really developed a new style of archaeology. Prior to their work at Jericho, what would happen, you would go to an archaeological site and you would survey everything that happened in this area, in this layer. And then you'd scrape it all off and go to the next layer. You'd figure it all out, then you'd scrape it all off. And by the time you got down to the bottom, you look around and you have nothing left that represented that civilization or civilizations. And so they perfected almost like, when you take a geological core sample and you look at the different strata. And so there's the Kenyon-Wheeler method of archaeology that looks at all the different layers. You don't get as much, you're not getting everything that was in that layer, but you're getting a core sample to see what happened at each of these years. Kathleen Kenyon was at Jericho and did incredible work. She never married. She was Christian, and I think she took a lot of heat for believing that there was no evidence of the walls come tumbling down in the way that some of her predecessors had thought the evidence would tell that story. But the thing I love about her, that she was a strong, powerful woman. I mean, look at her. You don't want to mess with her. She just gives me that feel. But they said about her that she loved three things: archaeology, dogs, and gin. And that was her life. And so I think she took the heat really well. Remember, Israel became a nation state in 48. And so her publications are in the 50s. And they were a huge deal. And so I just love her story. She was an incredible woman.
While the Arabs controlled it under the Ottoman Empire, they didn't let excavation going on. It's not until Israel actually began to own the territory that those excavations actually began. And we begin to learn so much incredible history. Jericho is a neat place. We're in trouble.
Okay, do you want to just... we have...
Yeah, let's see.
So we went...
Let me just pause for just a second, because we're laughing how much we still have to cover. Before we started tonight, we went, man, there's so much good stuff. We'll never get through it, and we're kind of going, we're in trouble. But let me just stop right here. Do you have any questions about Jericho or this understanding? They do believe they excavated 20 different cities being built on it that had been torn down 20 times, and the new civilization would rise up. Torn down, burned, and rise it up again. To think that it is one of the oldest cities in the world, and those kinds of stories and histories took place there. So very, very cool. Yeah. The question is, why did they have to go in and kill everybody? It's one of those fascinating... all the what? Ites. It really is. It's multiple answers can be given to that. And first of all, it's important to understand that you and I are asking that question from the lens of a 21st century person living in the United States, Christian. We bring a certain understanding of values that would be different from what you would have been looking at this point 3,000 years ago. Okay? Answers can be multiple. The ones that I always love to read in all the different theology books. One is very much you're going in, and God knew that if you move in and you're trying to learn what it means to be faithful and worship one God, and you have all these Canaanites, all these people who worship Baal, all the fertility cults, if they are there, what's the chance that you're going to stay true and not get pulled into that kind of temptation? And so the statement is, there was no way to have those people living there in order for you to be able to stay true, to know who God was calling you to be. Second statement sometimes is, that's the way war was done. It is the way that war was done. No matter who was fighting it, whether the people of Israel or the Canaanites or the Moabites, you win, and the only thing you do is you slaughter anything and everything. And so that was holy war, and that was the understanding of how war was supposed to be done.
So in either of those scenarios, if that's the tradition or if that's the story you would go with, look who is spared, the prostitute and all of her family. I mean, so if it's that kind of scenario, it's a statement of incredible grace that the lowest on that social totem pole was the one who was spared.
Third thing can be is that even though it was the way that people understood it to be, and Joshua may have been afraid of how they'd be tempted, that maybe he still misunderstood exactly what God would want. That would take time to come to understand. Where you have an angel that says, are you on my side or their side? And the angel says, I'm on God's side. Now you kind of move all the way for centuries ahead when the people of Israel begin to have stories like Jonah, where the story is Jonah wants God to wipe out every man, woman, and child and cattle, just like they did at Jericho. And God doesn't. He brings a message, repent, and the people do repent and believe, and all of them get spared, and that makes Jonah really mad. He doesn't want them to be spared and repent. He wants them to get it. Well, you can see a theology beginning to change within Israel to go, maybe Yahweh is not just Yahweh of Israel, He is God of all people. And so there's a development of theology you can see that is going on. So my guess is there's probably some of all three of those things that are happening there. Good question. Anything else? Yes, Richard.
Rahab was on the outer wall, is that correct?
Correct.
So did the walls come down and hers stayed up?
Again, when you go back and do some of the study of archaeology there was a time, and we don't know really why, the walls did fall down. Archaeologists like to argue about what year was that, or that would have happened. But regardless of when it would have happened, if it happened 500 years before the time of Joshua or happened at the time of Joshua, what they did see was not all the walls fell down. I mean, it's the way the Bible tends to make it sound, but when they did their excavations, it appears that part of the walls fell down, but not all of the walls. And it was two-tiered, if I'm not mistaken,
like a
two rings.
two-tiered, so the outer ring, the first defense system, and then an upper walled in level. So who would be on the outer perimeter wall? That's your kind of ghetto area, that if the walls are going to be attacked, these are the citizens who are going to get it first. So that's the cheap neighborhoods.
Right. Lower cost rent at those parts.
And
because if the army comes, we're the first ones to get it.
If you're a prostitute, it makes practical sense because to be on the outer wall, there probably wasn't any hassling of foreigners in that outer ring. It probably was easier for business for them to be in the outer ring. And probably, I mean, also socially, that was probably where her lot was supposed to be.
It says the walls fell down, and literally when they fall down, they're hitting the second wall, and it kind of like it makes us huge gates just to walk into the city. So not all of the walls, from the excavation point of view, came down. Mm-hmm. Great questions. Yeah. Nancy.
When did you know last week you handed out the paper that said Stone Age, Age, about which age is this time frame?
Okay, so
Well, the age is about what time frame is this going to wind up happening. We're probably looking more around 12 and 11 BCE because David, always a nice way to remember, David is right around 1,000. Okay? If you always got King David is, actually it's like 950 something, but I always kind of go 1,000. That's how I'd wind up remembering it. And so when Joshua's going to be coming in, you got Joshua, and then you're going to be moving through the Judges, and then after Judges, you're moving into Saul and to Samuel. So a couple hundred years before that, so we're probably looking more around 12 to 11, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Like the Copper and Bronze Age, which also makes sense because later on, this is how technology starts to keep advancing. But remember, the Israelites, as Bob was saying, they're out in the wilderness. They're in tents. You know, we talked about from the Stone Age, one of the things that happened, in the Stone Age, everybody's a hunter-gatherer, and they're kind of just for themselves. And one thing that starts to happen is people become able to domesticate animals and grow crops, and then you can stay in one place. The Israelite people are not staying in one place. They're able to have livestock, but they really are still living the life of a hunter-gatherer. And so you have hunter-gatherers coming to these peoples who have really gone almost, a couple ages of history beyond them. Because now you have the people who are in cities, they have the ability to study arts and tell stories, and so culture starts developing. Technology, weaponry, culture, civilization, and you still have basically hunter-gatherers. That's what he was saying when you have barbarians. That's kind of almost the evolutionary. If you look at people, how people have changed from in tents and they don't have any kind of towns to coming up to the big city.
Idea of Copper and Bronze Age would be where they were. We know from the kind of pots and things they would have. But Iron Age, as we're about to learn in just a few minutes, iron was not something the people of Israel had. But the Canaanites did. Other people had iron, and as we're going to see over these next 200 years, up to the time of King David, and then, which if we always kind of remember, 1,000, and you look to Solomon, what's going to be the big deal? Some people have chariots. They got iron. They also had weapons of iron. And the people, if you had weapons of iron, you were a much tougher army than people who still with sticks and a little bit of bronze and that sort of stuff. So it is going to be right on that cusp as they move in, and it's going to be how do the people of Israel also move into the Iron Age and have iron, which gives them chariots, which gives them weapons, and which will lead us to King Solomon and the greatest time of strength in the history of Israel, because they'll then have iron. But they didn't when they came into the Promised Land.
Let's skip David and Abigail
Okay.
and go to Elijah.
All right.
Such a good story.
That's such a great story. Mount Carmel, we're not going to have near the time to do Mount Carmel, but at least we'll get started with it because it's such an important story and such a great place to be able to go and to see. I'll just kind of tell the story a little bit. First, if you remember the story of Elijah and Mount Carmel, you go to 1 Kings and read the story of how Elijah just kind of pop on the scene. It just starts automatically, and it's like we all know that he is a prophet of God. And it turns out that you have Ahab, who is the king of Israel, and his wife Jezebel. It's a name that all of us would recognize. If you want to be mean to someone, you're a Jezebel. People may not realize why that was a mean name, but if you go back and read 1 Kings, you'll learn why that's a mean name. And so you had Jezebel married to Ahab. Ahab is a good Jew, and then Jezebel is a foreigner, and she brings all of her gods of Baal. And so gods of Baal are many gods. And so you bring her gods of Baal. She's always leaning on Ahab. Look, don't be worshiping Yahweh and following those traditions. Follow my traditions with the gods of Baal. You'd be surprised how many men get married and go to the church of their wives. The answer was yeah. I mean, we know, I watch all the time through the last 25 years, someone will lose a spouse, they will die, or they'll go through a divorce and get remarried. And if it's the man who's the member of St. Luke's, I'm always sweating who they're going to marry. Because I know, boy, if they marry this good Baptist or this good Catholic or someone, boom, I know they're going to be off and gone. That happens so much of the time. So
just don't marry a Jezebel.
Don't marry a Jezebel.
That's
the moral of the story. Wrap it up, we're done. So he marries Jezebel, and so he's trying to kind of go with the flow with Jezebel, and yet he's wanting also to be a follower of Yahweh. And you have Elijah, who's going, you're not following Yahweh, and he has made you king. What are you doing? So prophets usually are always bad news to kings, because prophets are willing to call them into accountability. And so that's what Elijah is doing to Ahab, calling him into accountability. And he finally says, Ahab, you are just a rotten, no-good dog is what you are. And I'm telling you, there is not going to be rain until God finally says it's going to rain, and I'll tell you when that is. And sure enough, boom, it stops raining, and this horrible drought comes. And so then there's famine, and people are now going to be almost starving. And Ahab is sending everybody out going, go find that Elijah guy. I want to talk to him. And Elijah's kind of staying out in the hinterland, and he's not being able to be found by Ahab. And so now things have gotten tougher and tougher. And this Sunday, in my sermon, we're going to be looking at this story of how Elijah comes to a widow and says, you got anything to drink? And then says, you got anything to eat? And she's going to choose to be kind. And we're going to talk about being kind and sharing what we have and that sort of thing. So you got a running start on Sunday, as we're going to be looking at Elijah when he comes to the widow. So after that, God says, all right, time's up. Go tell Ahab you want to visit. So he goes, and a servant sees Elijah, who knows Elijah, and Elijah says, go tell Ahab I'm here. And he went, oh man, if I go tell Ahab you're here, you're going to get out of here. And if I tell him you're here and then you come back and not here, he's going to kill me. He's going to shoot the messenger. I don't want to do that. And Elijah says, I'm going to be right here. Trust me. By golly, if I go tell Ahab you're here, you know I'm a good person. You better be here. Elijah said, I'll be here. So he goes and tells Ahab, hey, by the way, I found Elijah. I'll tell you where he is. He comes. Sure enough, Elijah is there, and they meet. And Ahab says, how are you, troubler of Israel? And he said, it isn't me, it's you who's the troubler of Israel. I tell you what you do. Go call all the prophets of Baal, 450 priests that your wife has brought into town, and I want us to go up on Mount Carmel, and we're going to have a little contest and see who's God. And so he says, then get all the people of Israel to come up. Now, when they say all the people of Israel will not fit up onto Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel is kind of a mountain range by this valley of Jezreel, which we're going to see, maybe. And so we're going to get the people up onto the mountain, and we're going to get 450 prophets of Baal. And the contest is, we each got an oxen, and we're going to build an altar, slaughter the oxen, and then we're going to ask God to light the fire. And so the prophets of Baal, you get to go first, and you may do whatever you need to do to get God to light the sacrifice. And so he goes up on the mountain, and they slaughter the animal, and put it on the altar. Oh, by the way, yeah, so we got him going, and so they're dancing around, they're hooping and hollering, and they're cutting themselves, and nothing is happening for hours. And finally Elijah says, look, if I was you, I'd holler a little louder. He could be sleeping. Or it could be that he's gone to take care of other things. The Bible tells you, actually what that says is he went to go relieve himself, bodily functions. Yeah, so I mean, he's really throwing it down. I mean, yeah, your God. I mean, he's out there taking a break. And so it goes on for hours and nothing happens. Finally says, are y'all done? We're done. Okay, so he then says to the people, tell me this day, who will you follow? And the people don't answer him a word. Which is an interesting thing. If you go all the way back to Joshua, why we wanted to tie these two together, Joshua said to the people, tell me this day who you will follow. That's what this is all about. Who will you follow? Are you going to follow Yahweh? As for me and my household, we will follow the Lord. And everybody in Israel goes, we will follow the Lord. Now we've moved along a couple hundred years. And where are we? We're up on Mount Carmel. And who will you follow? You can't go limping between two. And the people didn't answer him a word. And it's really the issue we were discussing earlier. What's the temptation? The Canaanites are still there. You know, we had this idea the people of Israel came in and wiped out all the Canaanites and took over the land. No. They managed to get themselves in and settled, but the Canaanites are still there. Other people are still living in the promised land.
They bought into the culture. When the Israelites came into the promised land, you know, they had been wanderers. They had had sheep and goats and stuff, but they come into the promised land, and basically they come into this very fertile area, especially at the Jezreel Valley. And these people obviously know how to farm, and the Israelites didn't. So they kind of go down to the local co-op and say, well, how do you have crops here? And they say, well, you get your seed and you plow the field, and then you get your two little gods and you set them up in, you know, your kitchen window and make sure they're facing each other, and then they'll procreate, and then your crops will grow. Well, the Israelites can see how that has worked for the Canaanites, and so they start buying into it because they don't want to risk being unsuccessful. And so they start getting into this culture, and they become just kind of synchronized in what's going on.
They still like Yahweh, but we are trying to become something different, and that's where the temptation becomes. So often culture leads us instead of us leading our culture. And so they start buying into it. And now you have Elijah saying, who will you follow? Decide this day. You can't go limping between two. It's kind of like Jesus saying years later, you cannot serve two masters. For you will love one and you will hate the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. A divided life leads to conflict. And that's what was happening very much with Elijah. The people were divided. There was the conflict. And so finally Elijah says, all right, get the bull. We kill the bull. We build the altar. And he says, dig a trench. Dig a deep trench around here. Now let's form a bucket brigade, bring in water, and let's start pouring it all over here. Why in the world would he start pouring water all over the sacrifice? I mean, what's harder to burn? A wet sacrifice. So it's like Elijah's trying to go, I don't just have a sacrifice, we're going to make it a wet sacrifice. I want you to bring so much water. We are awash in water. It's pouring everywhere. It's filled up all of the trench. We got water everywhere. And then he steps back and says, okay. Lightning comes down and it's like spit on a hot stove. I mean, everything is gone. Water and all.
It actually made that sound.
I mean, everything is gone. He didn't have to ask a second time, who do you serve? All the people said, wow, Yahweh is God. Yahweh, He is God. We're on your side, man. Wow, I'm glad. That's all it took with me to do that. And he says, go get those 450 prophets of Baal. Here we go back to this again. And we're going to take them all down there and they kill them all. So all 450 prophets of Baal are put to death.
Here's the nice.
And so, that's Elijah getting ready to whack another one.
Sweet Elijah.
Do what?
Sweet Elijah.
Sweet Elijah, there you go.
Yeah.
Another one's going to get it. So
there's a head, a decapitated head on this sculpture. So
it's what you do.
this is at Mount Carmel.
So all the prophets of Baal were killed. Even Ahab goes, man, that's good. I'm incredibly impressed. But soon as Jezebel hears, she is not happy. And she says, Elijah, what you did to my prophets, I will do to you before the sun goes down tomorrow. And now suddenly Elijah, who's been this strong person, I'm up here fighting for the Lord, he gets scared. And he starts to run. And we'll come back and look at the end of that part of the story. But what we need to know tonight is that Mount Carmel, I mean, they got monasteries there now. You've heard of the Carmelites? I mean, it goes back to Mount Carmel and Elijah and the battle for God. And it really comes back to this question that seems to be asked over and over through history. Whether we're getting ready to go into the promised land after wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, whom will you serve? The question really is, do you make God the foundation, the center, however you want to describe it? Do you make this commitment that fundamentally, I want to follow Christ, I want to live as God is calling me to live? Who do you say is such your values? Is it going to be God, Yahweh? Is it going to be Mammon, the gods of Baal, whatever else it might be? Everybody has a fundamental choice as to what is the thing that leads your life. Joshua says, make a decision this day. Who are you going to serve? Elijah's going to be on Mount Carmel hundreds of years later. Decide this day. Whom do you follow? Hundreds of years later, Jesus will say, you cannot serve two masters. For you will love one and you'll hate the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. You must choose. The message that takes place 3,000 plus years ago with Jericho and Mount Carmel and Jesus is still the message for us today. Know the things that matter most in your life. Because if you can stay true to that, then Jesus said you will have a life of peace. Without it, there is conflict. Boy, we left a lot of good stuff on the table. Okay.
So many good stories.
Yeah, there's so much good stories. We'll come back and talk about David and Abigail quickly next week. We got to, and we're going to have to.
Megiddo.
Yeah, we got to go to Megiddo next week. So, did you show them the picture of the valley so they at least see?
Okay, so this is the Jezreel Valley. This is the Mediterranean.
Not Jezebel, but the Jezreel Valley.
Jezreel. And here's the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River between them. Here's Jericho. And you can see why it's at a strategic place because it's between the mountains and it's one of the places you could cross. But here's a natural valley. Here's another look at, here's Mount Carmel range of mountains. Here's Megiddo, and we'll talk about that. Megiddo is the battlefield that we'll talk about Armageddon. Har, meaning mountain, mountain of Megiddo. But here's the fascinating one that shows you the lay of the land and why so many battles were fought here. So here's Megiddo, here's the Mount Carmel, the Carmel Mountains. You can see why this huge plain area is a battlefield. Tons of battles were fought here. Even Napoleon fought here, and he said, "Never have I seen a more perfect battlefield." And that's the Jezreel Valley. Just because you can see it's built up all the way around. If you're at Megiddo or on the Mount Carmel, you can look down and you can know when your enemies are headed your way. So this is that area, very important part of Israel's history and world history.
We will come back and look a little bit more at Mount Carmel and move into the rest of our stories then for next week. Remember, every day, find some way to be kind. Because you have been loved by Christ, we are called to love others in the way that we have been loved.
Hey, I got mine too.
I got it on the right, I got it on the left hand already. I managed to accomplish that today. I hope you're there with me. So, good luck. Have a great week. Oh my gosh. I mean...